Okay, I just got the bell that our session is ready to start. Um, Thanks everyone for joining today on a Saturday, and also it's really great. Yeah, continue please for those who are introducing themselves in the chat. It's really great for us to get a sense of who else is in the room. My name is Megan Doherty, and it is my absolute pleasure to be here with you today to be talking about human rights accountability in Canada. I work as the Director of Global Policy and Advocacy with Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. And we're a national organization that we provide frontline services, specifically around providing information on sexual and reproductive health. And then we also provide financial support and health system navigation for people who are seeking abortions and may not be able to afford them, or all of the things that are related to accessing an abortion. You know, some people have to travel far. Some people may not be insured. Some people may need help with childcare. So that's one of the main services that we provide. We also do a whole range of policy and advocacy work to the federal government to improve laws and policies related to sexual and reproductive health in Canada. And then we also work globally, primarily at the UN Human Rights Council. And this is my area of work. It's an area of work for me almost 20 years now, not all with Action Canada, but I've been working within the UN human rights system for about 20 years now. And what we do there is we work within the different mechanisms that are available, and I'm going to talk all about them during this session. But really, we work through the mechanisms to advance the norms and standards related to sexual and reproductive rights, but taken from its most broad and intersectional perspective. So that means while we do work on things like access to abortion or access to contraception, we also work on a wide range of issues such as rights related to water and sanitation, because it specifically intersects with issues related to menstruation. We also work on economic rights and looking at how that impacts people's ability to exercise their sexual and reproductive rights. So we do that sort of at that normative level. And then we also work with the country review mechanisms in Canada. So when Canada is due to be reviewed by the different treaty bodies and also the different other kinds of country review mechanisms. And we also work in collaboration with feminists and social justice actors from around the world to support them in their engagement through these processes. And so with that, what I will do is I'm just gonna jump right in and really here we go. I'm gonna pull my screen here. And actually, maybe one other thing before I get started. So one of the things, I was looking for a nice image for my cover of the presentation. And you'll see on the image that's here, it comes from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it's one of their pictures for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But with the tagline, it's our declaration. And that really struck me in thinking about what I wanted to present on today. And how it relates to human rights. They don't belong to states. They don't belong to some far-off system somewhere else in Geneva or New York. They belong to us. The Declaration and all the rights that are codified within it, they belong to us. And that's really the basis of the presentation today. So a few things, I just wanted to give an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So the first one is I wanted to share my human rights journey. Everybody comes to this work from different avenues and different spaces, and so I wanted to share mine. And then I'm going to outline the different mechanisms that are available and how you can use them. And then I'm going to look at accountability for human rights in Canada, see what that looks like and what are the opportunities available to us. and then a few resources. And I think what I might also say is that, oops, in the ways in which I'm using the screen, I will be on my slide screen, so I won't be able to see the questions if there's any that are coming through, but I will check back at sort of the end of each segment and really welcome any questions that you may have, or if there's an area where you think, oh, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about that. I think those at the John Humphrey Center know that I can talk about this forever. So I'm really happy to talk about any aspect of it. Okay. So this slide that I'm showing here is doesn't have a title, but it's what I wanted to use to tell you the story of my human rights journey. 20 years ago this year, I moved to Ireland, and I went there not really knowing very much about it. And I went to do my master's degree in women's studies. And what I learned very quickly when I got there was that abortion was completely criminalized. And living in Canada, I hadn't really thought about what it would mean if I needed to access an abortion and was not able to. And this was such a huge point of contention within Irish society, the ways in which it was criminalized, so almost no exceptions. There was one small exception that was written into the law, but it was never really used. And learning about what women in Ireland had to do when they needed an abortion. So each year, about 6,000 women used to travel to the UK to have an abortion while it was criminalized. But what that meant was that there were lots of people who could not travel. And so they were forced to carry pregnancies that risked their health, that they did not want, that for a whole range of different circumstances, it was just denied to them. And the public discourse around abortion was not that it was a human rights issue. It was that it was a religious issue. It was a profound moral issue. And law and policymakers did not want to touch it because they felt it was too toxic. And civil society, also, like mainstream civil society, did not engage with abortion because they also didn't, they thought it would detract from whatever their mission was. And this just struck me as outrageous. And I started to do street advocacy, participating in protests and leafleting and all of that kind of stuff. And then I got a job with the Irish Family Planning Association, which is the national sexual and reproductive health provider in Ireland. It is one of the member associations of the International Planned Parenthood. And a big part of my role was to figure out how we could decriminalize abortion. So, no small feat. And what we started to do was we started to engage the different UN treaty bodies because we couldn't talk about it in Ireland. Nobody would talk to us. We couldn't get an audience anywhere. And it was just, the doors were shut everywhere. So we went to the UN and we went to the different treaty bodies and explained what was happening, made the comparisons, and provided the evidence on how this was a violation of international law. And we got some very strong recommendations from those committees, but the government didn't really do anything about it. And it didn't really sort of move the needle in the way that we wanted it to, or that was going to have an impact in changing the law and making abortion more accessible for people. But then there was this new mechanism that was created at the UN Human Rights Council called the Universal Periodic Review. And in 2011 was going to be the first time that Ireland was going to be reviewed under this process. And so what happened during this process was that the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, they started this huge public campaign around the Universal Periodic Review and undertook to work with every facet of civil society to prepare a joint report. And at the Irish Family Planning Association, we were invited to join in that report. And it was the first time something like this had happened. And what it meant was that we were able to work with our colleagues, our friends, our comrades across civil society using a common language to be able to articulate the challenges that we were seeing and that we were experiencing, looking at reproductive rights, but also looking at persons with disabilities, people seeking asylum in Ireland, people living or people who were incarcerated, people who did not have houses, people living in poverty, and we worked together to articulate our demands in the context of human rights and to be able to understand what was at the root of the different issues that were affecting us and people within our communities. And I think of this as one of the watershed moments around in the journey to what I'm very happy to say. There was a referendum in Ireland in about well, a little less than 10 years later, so 2018, where abortion was decriminalized. But I really see this moment as a key moment in that journey. I mean, it didn't change things on its own, but it was one part of it. And so what we did is we all worked together, and there was such excitement among different communities about Ireland being reviewed in this UN mechanism. We had banners on buildings, we did videos, there were newspaper articles, there were consultations all around the country for people to articulate what was going on for them and to see themselves within the human rights framework. And it was really one of the most powerful experiences and really shaped me in how I understand and work with human rights now. So one, they are international legal mechanisms for sure, but they are also such a valuable tool for us to work together across different sectors in civil society to be able to advance these rights for everybody, everywhere. The universality of it, of human rights, is it's such a gift for us to be able to see each other's struggles in a way that allows us to practice real solidarity and to demand collective accountability from the government. So on this photo, we just have, or on this slide, we had this big banner around like when the UPR was going to be undertaken. You can see it's like a movie poster, coming soon. And then this was an article that was written in the Irish Times after the review, and we got 6 recommendations around abortion from the UPR. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but yes, we had big articles in the paper. This is a video of me delivering our statement to the Human Rights Council about Ireland's participation in this process. And then this one down here is it's a consultation. As you can see, it's standing room only. People really wanted to talk about their human rights, and these consultations took place in small towns, big cities, every county of Ireland, and I think it's a real testament to how people understand human rights and see themselves in this framework. So I offer this as an entrance into my presentation to share that my initial experience with these systems was one of tremendous solidarity, and I see the potential for that within Canada too. So, so now I'm just going to get into some practical pieces about human rights to sort of help set the structure for what I'm going to be talking about. So really, when we think about the promise of human rights, and at its most basic level, is that countries, they ratify these international human rights treaties, and by doing so, they agree to put in place domestic measures and legislations that are compatible with their treaty obligations and duties. And so international human rights law under the treaties, the way it works is that countries really are supposed to take what's in those treaties and put it into domestic legislation. So that will provide the most immediate protection for human rights. And it's, the direct the direct connection to people and to be so that it's the closest to them. But what we see is, often that's not the case, where even if there are laws that are enshrined or there are policies in place, often they're not implemented, or they're implemented in such a way that many people are not, they don't benefit from them. Or we see also where countries are doing things that are directly in contradiction to what's in international human rights law, and that there aren't the mechanisms in place nationally to be able to provide any meaningful remedies for people. And so this is where the international and also regional system can come into play, and you can use them to help ensure that these international human rights standards, that they are respected, implemented, and enforced at the local level. How that works in practice is not quite so straightforward, but that's the idea, and it's really like a safeguard for people, and this is so important for people who work on issues that are extremely stigmatized, or for which a significant portion of society thinks that these are not human rights issues, which then makes it very difficult to be able to find any space for advocacy, for change, for mobilization. The human rights framework and the system plays an important role in making sure that there is somewhere to go when you don't have anywhere to go nationally. And so that's the structure, the system. And then, but the real, at the heart of it, we talk about a human rights-based approach, human rights more broadly, but I think sometimes people make human rights often more complicated than they need to be. And so I wanted to share sort of what this is the standard definition of human rights, but it's what I always come back to. And human rights are designed to create an environment to support rights holders to claim their entitlements and duty bearers to meet their obligations. And so it's really about identifying who are the rights holders and who are the duty bearers. And oftentimes that's, the rights holders, we can identify them pretty quickly, but really it's about getting these duty bearers, the governments, to understand that they have obligations under international law, and working it's a very constructive way to balance this out, so that rights holders are able to claim their rights, and that duty bearers understand what they need to do, and that are supported in ways to meeting their obligation. And the principles that underpin the actions that need to be taken to do this are accountability, universality, interdependence, non-discrimination, participation, and empowerment. And we'll break those down a little bit more, but at its crux, this is what it is. Actually, I lied. There's one more slide related to this. When we're talking about state obligations under international law, international human rights law, they fall into three categories. So one is respect. That means that states have to refrain from interfering with or curtailing the enjoyment of rights. And protect, which requires states to protect individuals and groups against human rights abuses. And then this third one is fulfill, which often states conveniently forget that this is part of the obligation, but they have to take positive action to facilitate the enjoyment of basic human rights. So it's not enough to just not, to do nothing, right? Like there are positive obligations that states must do to make sure that everybody can realize their human rights. And I put this slide, I think my colleagues they think I'm a bit ridiculous sometimes, but I really do. I heart human rights, and I these are some of the reasons why. And I also wanted to share this with you as to to sort of share with you where I'm coming from on this. That I really believe in what human rights can offer. I am not naive to think that they are perfect or the systems are perfect, as you will hear in a little bit. But I come to this really firmly believing that human rights offer us the most useful framework for us to advance the rights and dignity of everybody everywhere. And why I think that is that they're actually way more practical than you might think. We often think of human rights as this sort of abstract political concept that's a nice idea, but has no real tangible pieces to it. But actually, human rights are very practical. There are a whole range of different documents, guidance, standards that have been built out over the last 75 years to break down what human rights look like in practice and what are the state's obligation, what does it mean, and how people can claim their rights. And one example that I would use is every 2 years, there's a resolution at the UN Human Rights Council on eliminating violence against women. And this is led by Canada. And Canada has been leading this resolution for, I don't know, 20 or 30 years or something. And each time the resolution comes up, what it does is it takes, the content that's in the different treaties, it takes the content that's in different reports that come out, takes into account the, whatever new context we're operating with, and then it spells out very specifically, like what the police have to do, what states have to do, what the obligations are of, or what rights people have to be able to access, trauma-informed care, sexuality education to prevent gender-based violence, transforming gender norms, like actually calling out patriarchy in a UN Human Rights Council resolution. And so if you go through these resolutions, like that's the roadmap that is based on human rights standards at a very, very practical level. And pretty much all of the issues that I imagine that we work on, there are human rights standards that have been built out that can help shape policy demands to our government. And also that the government has an obligation to implement. I also love them because they are for everyone, everywhere. There is no exceptionalism with human rights. The world seems to want to put itself into different categories all the time: global north, global south, rich, poor, white, black. But the same principles apply to everyone, whether you are in Canada or whether you are in Nigeria. And what it means is the principles remain the same. The context is obviously different, and the policies that are put in place will obviously be different too. But the principles and the standards remain the same. So states have these minimum level of obligations that they have to meet, and that regardless of where you live, what the context is, everybody has these rights, and that there is no room for exceptionalism. There is also dedicated space for civil society participation. This is particularly important, I think, for a lot of us who work as advocates, in that a lot of government processes or policymaking processes, they either have a consultation at the end of it so that they say that they did it, or there's, like you have to know the right people in order to get into the right rooms. With human rights, there are very specific processes that require civil society participation, and I think we could do a lot better job, promoting that information around how you can do it. But this is part of the process. There is no realization of human rights or no fulfillment of obligations if there is no civil society participation. It also can bring attention to neglected, stigmatized issues and areas. And as I mentioned, abortion was one, but also things like sex work. A lot of states, their national laws are terrible on sex work, and it's criminalized, or aspects of it are criminalized. And so they don't want to engage with it. And so you can use the human rights framework and the systems that are there to bring attention to what are the human rights violations that take place because of the criminalization of sex work. So again, it's this idea of it's everyone everywhere, right? So no matter what it is or who you are entitled to these rights. And this is a space in which you can open up a bit of space to be able to advocate for them. Also, they're constantly evolving. It's a really dynamic system, the human rights system. It's taking into account new information, new evidence. Also, the world is always changing. And so you have these treaties that were drafted, 30, 40, 50 years ago, but they're not static. They're constantly being applied and interpreted based on current events. And that's really important as, you have some folks who are trying to be like, well, this word is not in this treaty, and so there is no right to this. That's not how human rights work. They're constantly evolving, and they are based on, yes, you have these treaties, but those treaties are interpreted and applied. And then also because of the interdependence of rights. It's so important for us to be thinking about whatever the issue is that we're advocating on, that there is a whole range of other rights that are engaged, and you can't actually realize one right without the other rights being realized as well. So for us, we work on sexual and reproductive rights. That's one set of rights, but there is no sexual and reproductive rights if the health system is not functioning. If if the people are being put into prison for arbitrary reasons. If there is no schools for kids to go to school, none of these things are possible. Like sexual and reproductive rights are not possible unless we are seeing how it's connected to all of the other rights. There's also a focus on systemic root causes. And so this is also one of the things that I find quite helpful about human rights is there are spaces for which people can take individual complaints, but really what it's looking at is to identify what are these root causes and transform those so that these human rights violations don't happen again. And then international solidarity. This is one is very important for me, and I'm sure for many others, but it helps us not feel alone in our problems and in our challenges. And it enables us to work with people from different countries, contexts, cultures, in a way that is not based on, oh, it's so great in Canada, oh, it's terrible where you are, isn't that bad? No, it's about, your rights are just as important as mine. And if your rights are not fulfilled, my rights are not going to be fulfilled. So it enables you to practice solidarity and engage in coalitions and advocacy together that is transnational and that is based more on principles of collective demands for justice than it is on aspects of charity or sympathy or empathy. And that really, really appeals to me. And I realize I've been talking for half an hour and I've only just started into my slides, so I guess I better get going. So here I'm going to talk about, what are the different mechanisms that are available for us to use. This is not exhaustive, and this is just some of the main ones. And I wanted to share with folks, so what they are, and then also how you can use them, and then maybe a few non-traditional ways you can use them. So, so this slide here, this is a list of all of the international human rights treaties. And you may have heard of, this thing called the International Bill of Human Rights, which includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This category of an International Bill of Rights has no legal meaning, but what it serves as saying, like, this is the broad umbrella of rights for which these other treaties then provide specific protections for particular groups or under people under particular circumstances. But the civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, those 5 categories of rights are sort of the main bucket under which all human rights fall. And they are international treaties. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a legally binding instrument. It is a declaration, whereas the covenants are legally binding instruments. And so we have these 2 main ones, and then we also have the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, Degrading Treatment or Punishment. We have the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, Convention on all forms of racial discrimination, the Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, the rights of all migrant workers and their families, and the Convention on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities. And the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is the newest human rights convention, and it's also interesting because of the ways in which it was drafted, developed, and ratified. It was one of the most participatory processes out of all of the treaties because, the different processes had evolved, and advocates were very, very successful in making sure that there was meaningful participation of persons with disabilities who were drafting the declaration. And so it's also one of the ones that's used the most. So it's a really interesting sort of case study on, civil society participation, people who are the most impacted by these things participating in the process will also make the best use of these different mechanisms. And I would also just note that Canada has signed or has ratified all of these with the exception of the protection of all persons from enforced disappearances and the Convention on the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Their Families. But the other ones Canada has ratified. And so how these treaty bodies work is that for all the countries that have agreed to ratify them, they get reviewed under each of these treaties on how they're doing on the implementation of the treaty. Usually it's like every 5 to 7 years. Sometimes countries are very behind. There's also a backlog at the committee. But what happens is over the course of about a year, the country will, when it's due to be reviewed, the country itself will prepare a report. Civil society will also prepare what is known as shadow reports, saying these are the issues that they think are the committee needs to look at. And then there is a session in Geneva where you have the committee, which is comprised of independent human rights experts. They ask questions of the government and ask them to provide more information about, different areas of their responsibility under these treaties. Usually their questions are informed by civil society shadow reports. And then at the end of that, they issue what is known as concluding observations. And the government then is supposed to take those concluding observations and then use them to, inform the implementation of new laws, policies to ensure that they are able to fulfill their obligations under that particular treaty. And then when they come back in the next time, then they will have to report on the progress that they made, and then they'll deal with new issues that have come up, and that's part of that cycle. A lot of people are very familiar with this process and have participated in shadow reports and things like that. But there are a few other things that the treaty bodies do that there are opportunities for engagement and participation. So one are these things called general comments or general recommendations. And this is where they take one of the articles in the treaty and build it out, and they write sort of guidelines for states on what it means in practice to implement this right. These are super important in one advancing uh, ideas and standards and what is considered to be a human right. These are what the committee members then are using or they're looking for when countries are being reviewed. So, for example, the general comment on the right to health talks about how health services need to be available, they need to be accessible, they need to be acceptable, and they need to be of good quality. And then they break down further what that means. Accessible means that there has to be public transportation in order for people to be able to get to the hospital or the doctor. It needs to not cause financial hardship for people to be able to access the health system. For acceptable, it means that that the health system respects has cultural competency, or for young people that it is healthcare is provided in a way that young people are empowered and feel comfortable and are able to engage with it, to be able to sort of make their demands known, but also so that it's part of. I mean, that's a sort of another stream around public health, but that they need to be acceptable to the people who are using it. Good quality, medications can't be expired. There needs to the doctors need to have proper training, all of those kinds. So those things are in the general comments. One, I'm a big nerd about this, and so I find them fascinating, but also they're writing new general comments all the time. And so this is an opportunity to use examples from Canada to be able to inform what these general comments look like. So, for example, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, right now they're drafting a general comment on the right to health and racism. And we have brought forward information around forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada, racism within the health system overall, and what that means, and using examples of good practices, including the development of Joyce's principle. And so we have used that information to feed into that process in the hopes that what comes out we will then be able to use to help encourage Canada to fulfill its obligations. You can also do individual complaints, and so this is something that reproductive rights advocates have used a lot, because if there's no space for challenging restrictive abortion laws, you can take these cases to the treaty body committees. There's a whole process that you have to fulfill first, but it's possible. And then they can also conduct country inquiries. Now, Canada has not agreed to country inquiries and individual complaints for several of the treaties. And so this is something that Canada has regularly criticized on, because they haven't ratified what are known as these optional protocols that allow for these individual complaints and country inquiries. So they don't allow it for things like the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention Against Torture. And so this is also an area of advocacy, sort of encouraging Canada to ratify these different protocols to provide for these mechanisms for people in Canada. But then some other ways that you can use these treaty bodies in Canada is, if you're having a panel or you're having guest speakers or you're having some sort of an event, you can invite the treaty body committee members, and they can share, what does the human rights system say about this particular thing? They can be invited as parliamentary witnesses. You can use the concluding observations from states, concluding observations from the committees to inform law and policy development. can also use the information that comes out of these bodies to support court challenges. You can use it in research, and you can also appeal to the committee members to issue public statements on areas of concern. And there's another mechanism within the UN human rights system that is terrifically underused within Canadian civil society, which is called the UN Special Procedures. And these are 46 thematic and 14 country mandates. And with the mandate special procedures, really these are independent human rights experts that have their job is to look at specific human rights issues or specific countries and really monitor what's happening, to write reports, to inform the human rights standards overall. And they also play a big role in applying what's in these treaties to present day context. So there are mandates on the right to health. There is a mandate on racism and xenophobia. There's another one on the right to a clean and healthy environment. There's a whole range of them. And so they write these annual reports that they deliver to the Human Rights Council on particular issues. They always ask for submissions. And what often happens in these reports is that the reports pretty much target mostly Global South countries. And so the special procedures are really asking Global North countries to send them information so that they can show how that these rights are being violated everywhere in the world, not just in what is considered to be, less favorable human rights context. So there's tons of opportunities. These reports are so useful and fascinating in thinking about how particular human rights issues operate in different contexts, and also what we can do about it. The other thing that they do is they do country visits. And they go and they learn they meet with the government, they meet with civil society, and they learn about, what are the pressing human rights demands of the day in these countries. So this year, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Special Rapporteur on Modern Forms of Slavery, and the Special Rapporteur on Water and Sanitation did country visits to Canada. And it didn't even make the paper or the newspaper or any media reports. And the findings that the special rapporteurs came out with were, they were so damning. So, for example, with the Special Rapporteur on Modern Forms of Slavery, he was talking about the temporary foreign worker system that we have in Canada, in the ways in which, people who are in this system essentially have no rights, and no basic rights, and that it can be categorized as a contemporary form of slavery. So these country visits, they're really important. The special procedures, they really want to meet with civil society. And so if you hear of one that's of interest, I highly encourage you to participate. Another thing that you can do is you can write to the different special rapporteurs using the system of urgent communications. So, for example, if there is a piece of legislation that is going through the House that you think, okay, this is actually going to be really harmful and a violation of human rights, you can write to these special procedures and ask them to communicate with the government. So then they write to the government is obliged to respond, and they can also issue public statements, but they can also issue expert opinions. And so, for example, earlier this year, there was a bill that was going through the committees on trafficking that was going to expand the definition of trafficking so that people who are engaged in sex work would be effectively more criminalized than they already are. So we wrote to the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking and said, hey, this is happening. This is really dangerous. Could you please intervene? And turns out that they ended up stripping the bill because advocacy from sex worker groups was so amazing that they managed to end the bill. But that's an example of one of the things that you can do with that. And also, they build out the human rights standards. So, a lot of areas, for example, like I talked about earlier, that are stigmatized or neglected, they are these are the areas in which they are most interested, actually. And so they are your friend, your ally, and they are most of them, not all of them, I should say. Some are not very good, but the majority of them are very good, and they can help start building the case for different issues. Um, and again, you can use them in other ways. So there are these official processes, but you can also, like, they want to be engaged by civil society. And the other thing too with them is that um, there's the thing with special procedures is that it's not paid, right? And so you have to have another source of income or be able to work as an unpaid expert. So that means that there are really, diversity of special procedures, diversity of experience. It needs to be better. And so um, there are vacancies that are coming up all the time. Um, and we, through the work that we do and the coalitions that we work with, we are really trying to encourage people to apply to be a special procedure. There are so many people with such tremendous expertise who either think, that's too far away. I don't have the qualifications or the expertise. You do, you really do, and there are ways in which you can work with, for example, universities and things like that to be able to support the process of being a special procedure using, being unpaid. So if there's anybody who's really, really interested in this and really thinks, hey, yeah, maybe I could do that, I'm always happy to tell you more about how it works and what might be possible, that kind of thing. And then there's the Universal Periodic Review. And this is a pretty unique and new process. This one that I was telling you about in relation to Ireland is every country that's a member of the UN, so 193 countries, they're reviewed on its entire human rights record every 4.5 years. And this is a bit different than the treaty body process because this is actually a country-to-country process. So other countries are making recommendations to another country about how they can improve their human rights record. There is a very specific role for civil society within this process, and that is an official role that includes putting in stakeholder submissions and then making statements at the end. And Canada was just reviewed under this process on November the 10th, and Canada, over 120 countries made recommendations to Canada on how it can improve its human rights record. And Canada will have to make a decision on which recommendations it's going to accept in March 2024, which it will announce to the Human Rights Council. And most of the recommendations that come out of this are informed by civil society stakeholder submissions, because the government's report is like, everything's great. And so one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize about this process is that it's a little bit more accessible than the treaty monitoring bodies because the schedule is already set, right? So you can plan for it. And two, you don't have to have any specific expertise within in any of the treaties or human rights language. Really, what this process is designed for is for people to share their experiences and the challenges that they're having in a country, and you don't need to sort of say, well, this is violating Article 2 because of this. It's like, no, we have a housing crisis in Canada. There are a record number of homeless people right now, and people can't afford to find houses. Right? That's what they're looking for with these ones. And then, even though there is this process that happens in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, for the next 4 years, it should be about Canada, in Canada. Canada should be, thinking about how they are going to implement these recommendations, be reporting on their progress, be measuring their progress, be planning for the next UPR. And so there is this small moment in Geneva, but really the rest of the process happens in Canada. And which leads me to the not so fun part of my presentation, which is international human rights accountability in Canada. And we have a lot of work to do in this area. So right now, the Federal Department of Heritage, they lead coordination on this. So you might be thinking, why is it heritage? That seems kind of weird. I wish I knew the answer to this. I don't, but they are the ones who are responsible for coordination. And this word coordination is really important because they don't consider themselves to be mandated as accountable. They only serve as a coordination function. So they basically ask all the different provinces and territories and different government departments to send the information when Canada is going before a treaty monitoring body. And then they share out to those different levels of government when the recommendations or concluding observations come in. There is a very small and under-resourced human rights secretariat within the Department of Heritage, which is also responsible for doing a lot of the coordination for the other pieces that are here on the slide and for communicating with civil society. So I'm just gonna kind of leave that one there. Human rights accountability is a shared responsibility in Canada, so federally, provincially, and territorially. And while Canada is not unique in being a federal system, lots of other countries have this kind of a system. What we often see is that because it's a shared responsibility, that then no one is responsible. And so, the jurisdictional sort of excuses that come up around the non-implementation or the inconsistent implementation across different jurisdictions, we see this issue come up. That's a provincial responsibility, or that's a federal responsibility. But actually, under international human rights law, the federal government holds the ultimate responsibility for overall implementation across the country, and it's their job to figure it out. And so it's not enough to just say that, that's not our jurisdiction. It is a legal obligation that the federal government has undertaken under international law. Now, these next few points I have here are some of the different structures that the government has set up to. I wish I could tell you what they were supposed to do. So I'm just going to read them out, and then I'm just going to talk about them as a whole. Okay, so you have the Continuing Committee of Officials on Human Rights. So this includes federal and provincial representatives. Then you have the Senior Officials Committee responsible for human rights, and these are usually deputy minister or assistant deputy minister levels, provincially, territorially, and federally. And then you have the Forum of Federal, Provincial, and Territorial Ministers for Human Rights. These are the structures that they have set up. And when you go and you read the mandate or the terms of reference for them, and including these protocols for follow-ups and engagement strategies, the language choices for them are, they're very much on purpose, right? They use words like communication, collaboration, coordination. There are no language there is no language that focuses on who is accountable. How are these things going to be measured? How are we going to make sure that we are being transparent? How can civil society and people living in Canada learn more about what recommendations Canada has received, and what we are doing collectively to implement them? And so there's a whole range of different issues with these structures that are set up. They're not transparent. And often these meetings, like when they have these meetings, they end with no firm conclusions, commitments, decisions. It's just like, oh, this is really important, and we will continue to pay attention to this. And they also don't meet very regularly. So this Forum of Federal, Provincial, and Territorial Ministers for Human Rights, they meet every 2 years. And so we have a lot of work to do. And so here, I've just put in a little bit more specific information around what are the specific challenges. So we don't have high-level leadership on human rights in Canada at the federal level. So it's sort of buried within the Department of Heritage, but the minister who would be responsible for or accountable, who has to answer for these, sort of lack of implementation, we don't really have anybody like that. We also don't have a national accountability mechanism. The governments will point to these other continuing committees, but that's not a national accountability mechanism. There's because it's not a defined process in which people understand how to participate, and for all the reasons I outlined earlier. We have also discovered, very worryingly, that there's a limited knowledge or understanding of human rights obligations at different jurisdictional levels among officials. So, for example, in meetings where there are provincial and federal and territorial representatives, really a lot of representatives not understanding that this is an actual legal obligation. This is not something just that civil society is asking for. This is not just a nice thing to do, and don't really understand what the treaties say or what they mean or what the implications of non-implementation mean. It's quite concerning. Engagement with civil society is limited. And so often we may get asked for a consultation after a process is over. This is what happened with the EPR. There was no consultation until after Canada was reviewed. Like, that is just not acceptable. It's often ad hoc. So, we randomly will get invitations to attend consultations without understanding, like, what's the purpose or what is going to come out of this. How are the officials going to take what they heard in these sessions and apply them to policy development, and then sort of feedback what they are doing and how they have taken that on board. So they're not meaningful, and so you kind of end up having the same meeting over and over and over again. And understandably, folks are getting very frustrated and are questioning the value of engaging in these systems. There's also a lack of transparency on status of recommendation implementation. Like, every time Canada sends a report into one of these UN committees, we're all surprised about what's in there, right? Like, because we don't know. Very critically, there is a rejection of the justiciability of economic, social, and cultural rights in Canada. So Canada receives a lot of recommendations around things like access to health services, and the government sort of does not accept that, and they don't accept that this is something that that people can claim their rights through the court system for, and this is a huge problem. So you cannot say that you are a human rights champion and then reject economic, social, and cultural rights. And then we're also having a serious credibility crisis between national and international positions on human rights. So internationally, Canada presents itself as this champion of human rights, but nationally, it's not great. And we have people are losing faith in the promise and the value of human rights because there is no mechanism for them to be able to engage with meaningfully. And so this credibility crisis needs to be addressed urgently. From a political level, Canada is running for a seat on the Human Rights Council 2028 to 2030. That you cannot have this kind of a credibility crisis in when you're going for big international seats like that. So now I'm going to move to the more hopeful part, which is what the opportunities are. So human rights aren't broken. We have the world is in such a terrible shape right now. So many things between the climate crisis, the war on Gaza, violence against women, like the corrupt financial systems. Even somebody like me who is so hopeful about human rights, I was just thinking like, oh God, is this the end of human rights? And I was listening to a speech from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he was talking about how no, human rights have not failed. Leaders have failed because they have not fulfilled their promises and obligations to human rights. We already have this amazing, wonderful, conceptual and practical framework to ensure peace, justice, and dignity for all. And what we're seeing in the world right now is the total disregard for that. And what we need to do is we need to reclaim those rights. We need to reclaim those systems. We need human rights now more than ever. It's not a time to sort of think that, well, these are not useful for us anymore. They are more useful now than ever. And so we need to reclaim them because they belong to each and every one of us. They don't belong to governments. They don't belong to corporate actors. They belong to us. And we need them. And we need to reclaim them. And we need a brand new human rights infrastructure in Canada. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more tomorrow with our, I'm going to do a preview with the panel that we're engaging with tomorrow. And then one of the main stages around mobilizing civil society for human rights in Canada. But we really need a brand new human rights infrastructure. The system we have, that is definitely broken. That is not useful. That is a failure of imagination, that system. We need to exercise our imagination. We need to build on all of the evidence and the work that folks have done in the Office of the High Commissioner, in other countries, human rights defenders, academics, experts. It's there. It works and operates in other countries. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what we have right now in Canada. So, these are some ideas around what a new human rights infrastructure could look like. We need a federal minister for human rights. We need civil servants with knowledge and expertise in human rights. We need human rights indicators for policy development across the government. We need the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to come and help the Canadian government through technical assistance to build these systems. And we need meaningful and statutory engagement with Indigenous peoples, civil society, rights holders at all stages that is predictable, it's open to all, and it's resourced. We also need an increased role of Parliament. There are committees that are set up that could be providing more scrutiny and offer more accountability on these issues, and they are not taking full advantage of that. And we need more human rights education across all of society. The human rights, they help us understand a lot of the issues that are happening around the world, and they also provide an avenue for action. And I don't know for you, but for me, I feel really hopeless when I can't do anything about anything. And so human rights provide an avenue to think about how you can take action to improve what's going on. And this is just, these are three resources I just wanted to share. The first one is the Universal Human Rights Index. So if you go to this website and you click on Canada, there you will get every single recommendation that Canada has received across all the different human rights mechanisms, and you can filter it for issue. But um, I, I think a lot of people don't know about this, and it's very handy. It's also really interesting to see what issues have been raised with Canada um, over time and continue to be raised over time. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has a ton of resources on the practical application of human rights, the different mechanisms, how you engage, all of those kinds of things. And then I put the World Health Organization. They have a whole section dedicated to human rights and health. And I mean, I work on health a lot, and so I find it very useful. The World Health Organization has helped to also advance these standards, and they have a symbiotic relationship with the human rights standards in the Human Rights Office. And for those of you who work on health from a human rights-based approach, you know how challenging it is in Canada to work in that way, because Canada does not recognize the justiciability of the right to health. So if you're looking for more information there, you can look there. And also, Action Canada, we work on this. We work on this issue every day. We work in this system. We want to share whatever information, whatever access, whatever knowledge. We love getting questions, and if there's any way that we can help, we are ready. We work on sexual and reproductive rights, I told you, but our mandate is interconnected to every single human right. And we also firmly believe in working in solidarity and collectively as civil society to build these movements for human rights. So with that, I think I will end my main presentation, and I hope that folks have questions. If you want to share any comments, Renee, if you want to jump in and just turn on your screen and video if you have anything to add. Yeah, I would welcome that. Oh, thanks you, Angelica, for putting the upcoming special rapporteur visits in the chat. Does anybody have any comments either? Oh, Angelica, hi.
Hi. Well, we had some comments, Megan, during your presentation. Let me scroll through them rather. Blah blah. Okay, so I wonder if you talk a little bit about the special rapporteur visits and how there's an opportunity for engagement there. Can you elaborate a bit of like how is it, how much engagement there has been? Like, where can we work together in promoting those visits? How can we make them more impactful?
Sure. So before a special rapporteur comes to make a country visit, there's a couple things that you have to do. So if you're interested in a particular area, you kind of have to monitor the page. However, once they do make an announcement about where they're going, they will usually request submissions of information, so that you don't have to write a report or anything like that. You can just write. They have an email address that's set up. You can write and say, I am from the John Humphrey Center. I would like to organize a consultation on the special rapporteur's visit. Please let me know if this is possible. They're usually quite keen for that. You can also ask them if they have a main civil society partner in Canada that they're organizing with. Often that will be the case. So we were the main civil society organizing partner when the Special Rapporteur on Health came to Canada. So you can ask that. You can send in reports. You can send in a compilation of the recommendations that Canada has received from the treaty bodies related to the particular issue. Usually their staff are, they're really wonderful, and they really depend on civil society to help make the most of the visit. So that's what you can do before. And then you can ask to be kept up to date around what's happening. So when the Special Rapporteur comes, as we know, Canada's a big place, and so they can't always go everywhere. So you want to find out where the consultations are being held. So if you want to go in person, usually they will also offer a virtual option, so you can provide your feedback directly. And then what is useful is, so the Special Rapporteur will also be meeting with the government and usually Indigenous peoples, and then they will issue an initial press statement at the end of the visit. So folks can amplify that. They can do their own press statement. They can do their own commentary. They can share it on social media, and then usually a couple months later, the full official report then gets presented to the Human Rights Council. And there you have an opportunity to make an official statement to the council around what your observations are from that Special Rapporteur's visit. And also Canada will be making an official statement when the report is presented as well. So you can watch that online, but also, like we did, Action Canada and the John Humphrey Centre, following the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples' visit to Canada, we did a statement together, which Angelica recorded and read out, really welcoming the visit and reaffirming the recommendations and urging the Canadian government to implement them. And yeah, there's lots of other ways you can use it, but those are like very practical, like moments of engagement there. And yeah, also if there's Amnesty, I don't want to volunteer them for anything, but they usually have their sort of fingers on the pulse of who is coming to Canada as well. So they're also another resource. I mean, I don't want to volunteer them, but they usually do know.
Okay, good, awesome. I think we have a few comments here saying how amazing your presentation was and how insightful, and kind of reviving. Thank you for reviving that hope and human rights. Sometimes it's really hard to keep it up. So that is really good. So Praveen is asking, how can we get the OHCHR to come in and help Canada restructure our human rights system as recommended? Is there political will to reimagine the current infrastructure?
So I don't think that there will be political will on their own, and I think we need to create political will through civil society pressure. And really, we have raised with the Office of the High Commissioner, this idea of coming to Canada to provide technical assistance on this, and they're really open to it. But the thing is that Canada has to invite them, and so OHCHR can't come in on its own. They have to be invited. So this is the first sort of advocacy target, is or one of the first asks, I would say, is to get Canada to invite OHCHR to come and provide technical assistance. And Canada will not want to do that because, one, it would be admitting that their human rights infrastructure is not up to par, but also because usually that process is used or recommended to countries that we would consider as having a very poor human rights record. And so on the one hand, I think Canada would find it very embarrassing. But on the other hand, it's an opportunity for Canada to say, we can all do better on human rights. And yeah, I got to work on the crafting of the message for that, but we really need it, right? There is a total failure of imagination within like the conception of human rights in our official structures, and we need different perspectives.
Awesome. And so I guess following that, Parveen is asking, is there political will to reimagine the current infrastructure? Is there any energy or any initiatives that you know of? I add to Parveen's question.
So I think civil society is very keen for this. And I think human rights are a bit of a hot potato for government, one for its content, but also for these jurisdictional issues. And so, so there are lots of us within civil society who participate in these processes a lot, who have been really, really pushing for this. And yeah, again, so I don't think that the political will is there yet, but I think that, so like this is actually from my perspective for civil society, we all have our individual issues that we work on. But if we don't come together to really think about the system as a whole and how everybody can use it, none of our issues are going to be able to move forward. And so from my vantage point, that is the main area of collective mobilization that you will hear lots more about tomorrow as well, that we need to focus on. We need to create that pressure. We need to, show them how to do it, what it can look like, what it can offer, how it will benefit Canadians. So you make it like a political impossibility not to do it. And so we need to do that together from every sector.
Yes, urgent. And so thank you for bringing attention on tomorrow's panel and conversation. And also, like, there is a conversation time and we're hoping to actually engage with this kind of issues after 9 days of preparing for them, just make sure that we all engage in this kind of conversation. Thank you, Megan, for bringing that up. And we have another question from tomorrow afternoon, says Renee. So important. Renee, if you can remind us the time on Mountain Standard. Sometimes my brain gets mixed up into with the time zones. Okay, 2:30, perfect. And so how does Parveen ask, how does the special rapporteur ensures that they don't miss crucial group or sector during their visit? Do they rely completely on CSOs to ensure that comprehensiveness?
So there's a couple things that they do. I mean, they rely on people in country to advise them on, who they should be visiting with, like which groups. But as we know, there are always people who are not, not fit. They are not visited, or they are not considered in these kinds of visits. And so they can ask the government, but of course the government's probably not the best source for that. And they will usually go back to, different recommendations or observations that previous special rapporteurs have made, or the different committees. And then they will ask civil society, like, who else should be at the table? And I think that's also on us. We need to be thinking about who is not at the table, who is not invited, or if they're invited and they don't come, like what are the barriers to participation? And I think, if for those of us who are in positions of privilege, to be able to kind of understand how these systems work, to have the space and time to work through them, that's on us to make sure that we are making space for a whole range of different people to participate. Sorry, that's not an easy answer, but that's what I got right now.
That's great. I think that there's a lot that we as a civil society should and can do to make sure that we kind of spread the message and bring as many people as we can, and all representation. Yes. So Chelsea is asking about, what are your thoughts and practical strategies to educate and reach Canadians who are not as connected to human rights advocacy, academia, etc., or to make human rights more accessible to the public?
So I think I think this is a question we ask ourselves a lot. But I think I would go back to my experience with the Universal Periodic Review in Ireland. Most of the people who participated in that process are not advocates or academics. These are people who, we held public meetings and just said, we are putting together a report on human rights. And do you have something you want to tell us? Do you have anything that you want to bring to the UN, right? And so we framed it in such a way that it was like, you didn't need to have like human rights expertise, background, which I know can be quite alienating for people, but it's like, are you having or are you experiencing structural barriers to anything? We said it a little bit more accessible than that, but that's really what it was. And so, and people came. People really wanted to come and talk and share, and they, would talk to others who had very similar experiences, and then working to articulate those experiences into human rights demands. And it was such an empowering experience for for me. I don't want to speak for anybody else, but it was such an empowering experience for me because when you're having a problem and it's like you think you're the only one, you think this is this is the world, the systems, whatever, there is nothing that I can do, and that when you ask for help, that it's like you're asking somebody to say, oh, you're in a really terrible situation, I'm sorry for you, so I'll help you out this one time, right? And when you think about it on a human rights perspective, it's not like you actually get to shift the power, because it's not, you have to explain why you are deserving of some sort of benefit from the state, but that the state has an obligation to provide that for you. And if it doesn't, it has to explain why. And so people were starting to articulate what was going on for them in ways that was like made them feel very powerful, and also was quite scary for the government, to be honest, because they rely on, like, the state relies on people to buy into a system where the power of popular education. So they rely on a system where we are not informed around our rights or how to claim them, and so I think these, for example, the UPR, Canada is going to be reviewed on the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women next year. There are 2 special procedure visits. We can take those and host like community meetings, public meetings. Come tell us about your things, and that's what I mean. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that, or a lot of organizing, but like those are things that you can do. We have to find ways to make human rights more connected to people's everyday lives so that they are able to be informed around what their entitlements are, and to be able to make those demands to the government.
Thank you. Whew, a lot of work, but I think that there is a lot that we can build on. No, that's great. Thank you for. I think that perspective of making, how practical and how applicable and how empowering human rights and the language of human rights is. I think is something that we really need to embody in the upcoming years in Canada. We really need to work on that. So thank you so much, Megan. I don't know if anyone else has any more questions or comments. I think we all loved and learned a lot. We really appreciate your time, and we're really happy to see that we're going to see you again tomorrow and that you're going to be engaging.
Thank you so much. One, for inviting me, of course. I feel very grateful and honored to be here, but also for doing this. This is, it's a huge undertaking that you have all undertaken to run this convention, but it couldn't have come at a better time. And so I am very grateful to everybody who attends, participates, talks, organizes. It's really exciting. So thank you to you.
Thank you. It's being our pleasure. Thank you, Megan, again, and thank you, everyone. So it is almost noon Mountain Standard Time and 2 p.m. here in Ontario, 3 for you, Megan. We will have a break for the next half an hour, and then we will have another set of sessions if I'm reading the schedule right. Thank you again.
Bye.